Hello everybody, Treno here, and in today's episode we are going to take another look at Soviet/Russian tanks that still need adding to War Thunder. If you haven't seen the first episode, I would recommend you watch that as well, where we covered the initial triple-barreled KV-7 design, the KV-8 flamethrower tank, and the BA-10M armoured car. But with that out of the way, let's look at the tanks of this episode. For our first tank, we return to the story of the KV-7, which we first looked at in the last episode in its 3-gun configuration. And when we last left the story, the 3-gun KV-7 had just been cancelled by a decree by Stalin himself. Bear in mind he was the one who ordered it created in the first place. But that same decree, instead of ordering it completely scrapped, instead ordered it to be converted into a 2-gun tank. So he'd obviously not quite lost his interest in multi-gun tanks yet. The 3-gun KV-7 had been armed with one 76mm gun and two 45mm guns, but this new KV-7 was to be armed with two 76mm guns in a U-14 mount, installed in what was described as a fixed turret, but was essentially what we would call today a casemate. These guns were to be capable of firing both individually and in salvos, with specifications calling for it to have at minimum a 70% faster firing rate than the regular KV-1 when firing the guns separately, or in other words, increase the rate of fire from 7.5 rounds a minute to around 12.7. In the operational requirement specifications, it was ordered that the guns should have a traverse of 2.5 degrees left and right, and an elevation of -5 to +20 degrees, while an ammunition loadout of 120 to 150 rounds was to be carried. In addition to this armament, it was to be armed with one DT machine gun in the bow and two in the rear of the fighting compartment. Armour for the hull would remain the same as the regular KV-1 at 75mm for the front and sides and 70mm for the rear, while the mantle itself was to be at least 75mm thick, making this a pretty well protected tank. Despite weighing over 50 tonnes, mobility was slated to remain broadly the same as the regular KV-1, while the crew would number 6, likely a driver and bow machine gunner in the hull, with one gunner, two loaders and a commander in the fighting compartment. The KV-7 was converted to the new twin mount, and it was successfully tested. There were some issues identified, for example traversing the guns required both hands, while operating the trigger required a great deal of effort. But in general, the KV-7 does seem to have worked, and it had a rate of fire when firing salvos of around 6 to 7 salvos per minute, which would have been roughly the same as the KV-1's fire rate with its one gun. Unfortunately, the fire rate when firing the guns separately isn't given. However, by now, interesting tanks with multiple gun barrels seems to have waned, and efforts were instead focused on tanks carrying one massive cannon instead of two or more smaller ones. While the KV-7 itself was used in various tests up to 1943, it was eventually scrapped in December of that year. However, while it doesn't seem to have done particularly well in real life, it could have a second lease of life in War Thunder. Personally, I could see the 2-gun KV-7 being added as an event or premium tank at around 4.0, as while it has the same gun stats as the KV-1 CIS-5 at 4.3, it will of course be disadvantaged by the fact that its main weaponry is situated within a casemate like on a tank destroyer. Indeed, it probably will be used primarily as a tank destroyer, where you can either fire both of your guns at once, completely obliterating any enemies in front of you, or you could fire the guns separately, which would allow you to have an almost continuous rate of fire, which is quite unique amongst tank destroyers. Overall, I think the KV-7 would be a pretty successful tank in War Thunder, and I think it would be a lot of fun and would quite quickly become a meme-worthy tank within the community. For our next tank, we have a rather important variant of the T-34, the T-34-85 Model 1945, which would be a good improvement over the already in-game T-34-85. The Model 1945, which confusingly actually started production in 1944, was a T-34-85 with some modest improvements over the previous T-34-85s, namely the addition of smoke canisters at the rear of the tank, and the addition of an electrical traverse system, something which had been standard in previous T-34s, but had been removed from the early Model 1944s due to a lack of space in the turret. The turret traverse of the model 1945 is unlikely to be better than the existing T-34-85, however, as while it's a little unclear, I believe the already in-game T-34-85 is meant to represent a late model 1944, which does retain the electrical traverse and turret rotation speed of the previous T-34s. Although, looking at the model, it doesn't actually have the bulge on the left side of the turret, which is required to fit the electrical traverse. As you can see here, it does look like it has it, but if you look at it from an angle, the area is completely flat. The model 1945, by contrast, has this bulge on the left side of the turret, as well as a bulge around the edge of the cupola on the left side of the turret, and a single hatch design for the cupola, which contrasts with the in-game T-34-85, which doesn't have the bulge around the cupola and has a twin hatch design. In addition to the turret changes, we have a first in Soviet tanks, with the model 1945 being fitted with two MDSH smoke canisters mounted at the rear of the tank. Of course, being rear mounted, they can't be used to throw a smoke barrage in front of you like on some other tanks, but it is still an improvement over not having any smoke laying capability at all. Additionally, the T-34-100 premium tank already has these smoke canisters fitted, so adding these to a regular T-34 should be an easy and much welcomed addition. Everything else about the tank is the same as the already in-game T-34-85, with the same crew, armour and armament. So having electrical turret traverse by default and the addition of smoke canisters are minor rather than major improvements over the already in-game T-34-85. When adding the model 1945 to War Thunder, I think Gaijin could take the opportunity to rework the existing T-34-85 as well, by taking the existing tank and remodelling it into two variants. One as an early model 1944 with the manual traverse, which can be folded with the T-34 D5T, and another variant as the later model 1944, with the electrical traverse but without the smoke canisters. This would be placed in the existing T-34-85's position, and the model 1945, with its power traverse and smoke canisters, would then be folded with it. I can't imagine the changes to the model 1945 would be big enough to warrant an increase in battle rating, so it can remain at 5.7. Overall, this is a minor change on the face of it, but I feel this would be a great addition to the Soviet tech tree, giving us a tank variant that is not usually talked about, and finally introducing smoke canisters to Soviet World War II era tanks, something I feel should have been done a long time ago. And interestingly does sort of go against the Russian bias claims, because of course Russian tanks don't really have smoke canisters, which they really should have. We now come to a tank that would be rather easy to add to War Thunder, the OT-34, which stands for Ognyemetny Tank 34 or Flamethrower Tank 34. Unlike the KV-8 which we looked at in the previous episode, and had major changes to its main armament, the OT-34 is essentially the same as the regular 76mm armed T-34s, but the bow machine gun has been replaced by a flamethrower, either an ATO-41 or the improved ATO-42. I would suggest using the ATO-42 flamethrower, which has a range of about 90 to 110 meters and is capable of 6 2-second bursts. In addition to the flamethrower, a 200-litre tank was carried with the necessary fuel for the flamethrower. Fitting the flamethrower necessitated moving the radio to the rear of the turret, and of course while having the fuel tank mounted internally does protect it from small arms fire and the like. If a shot does penetrate and damages the fuel tank, there is the possibility of a fire or even an explosion, making the OT-34 more vulnerable compared to regular T-34-76s. The OT-34 would essentially play almost identically to its non-flamethrower counterparts, though with more lethality to soft skin and open-topped vehicles, so the battle rating of whichever tank is ultimately used would not need changing. This would likely be the same battle rating as the T-34 model 1942, but again it could use other T-34s if needed. It is also likely to be added as an event or battle pass tank, much like the Churchill Crocodile when it was recently added to War Thunder. Overall, I think this would be a rather welcome addition to the Soviet tech tree, and a good alternative to the KV-8 flamethrower tank that we looked at in the last episode, with one of the big advantages to the OT-34 being that it can still function as an effective gun tank, as it only required minimal modifications, as well as being a rather iconic tank of the Red Army, which I'm sure many players will be rather excited to get a hold of. So, having looked at these tanks, I would be interested to hear your views on them, as well as other Soviet tanks that you would like me to cover. I look forward to reading your comments below. But anyway, that's it for this week's episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've been Tyranno, and I'll see you next time.